Marijuana stocks continue to spark investor interest as the industry chews away at legal barriers. How will the growing push for federal legalization shape the market in the coming year? Can leading pot players inch closer to profitability? And what growth opportunities are out there for new industries and investors? Joining me to discuss all this is David Abernathy. He's the Vice President of Research and Consulting at the ArcView Group. So, David, it's so great to have you here. And kind of the thing we heard out of the 2020 election was that the real winner was pot. And as we kind of look at this growing push for federal legalization, what do you think this means for the cannabis industry?
I think it means a lot. Federal legalization is certainly plausible within the next couple of years, and that will really dramatically change the landscape for legal cannabis. Legal cannabis has existed in this very strange regulatory space in which the federal government maintains that it is 100% illegal, but many states, I think 36 states now plus Washington, D.C., have legalized it for medical use, and 15 states for just general adult use. This creates a big conflict in the law that makes it very difficult for companies to operate. It also has created this really artificially siloed marketplace in which each state is completely separate from every other state in terms of its cannabis supply chain. So it's created some unique market and economic dynamics, and some of that is likely to continue post legalization, and some of that is likely to very dramatically change. So looking at how legalization might affect that tells you a lot about what businesses are likely to do well and what businesses are likely to struggle.
Right. And you mentioned kind of this gray market. So what areas do you think will change? I know banking's kind of been a huge issue with some of these companies. We've seen a lot of mergers and acquisitions. So what do you think the biggest change might be?
Sure. So there are a few things where we have quite a bit of good information about what's likely to change, and there are some areas where there's still quite a bit of uncertainty. You mentioned banking. That's a huge one. A lot of cannabis businesses still have trouble getting basic banking services, bank accounts, merchant services, things like that. That really makes it quite difficult to do business. It also has created these opportunities for cashless payment transactions and all sorts of other niche financial technologies that you wouldn't see in most markets. One way or another, federal legalization is likely to resolve those banking issues. Whether it gets resolved through a standalone banking bill like safe banking, or cannabis just gets moved off of the Controlled Substances Act drug schedule, banks are likely to very quickly start just doing business with cannabis businesses. One of the areas where there's still quite a bit of uncertainty is under some new federal legalization regulatory regime, is cannabis allowed to be transported across state lines? This will have an absolutely enormous effect on the industry. As I mentioned, right now, every state has its supply chain from cultivation to processing to manufacturing to sales completely siloed within each state. If cannabis is allowed to be shipped from state to state, then you start to see opportunities for states like California and Washington and Oregon, which produce a huge amount of high quality cannabis at relatively low price, to outcompete states that produce less, have a higher cost of production, and just might not be able to compete with the scale and experience of some of those large early Western states.
Do you see maybe profitability potentially happening soon if there can be a little bit more certainty around the legal issues in this industry?
Sure, there are several things at play there. First, there are quite a few cannabis companies that are already profitable. The biggest ones, the big publicly traded ones, a lot of them are not. Some of that has to do with sort of missteps by management. Some of that has to do with strategic investments in growth. Some of that has to do with things like 280E. There's an IRS rule called Rule 280E, which was a largely symbolic rule put on the books, I think in the 80s, that the IRS promptly forgot about. It basically says that if your business is selling illicit drugs, you're not allowed to take normal business tax deductions. This was, of course, largely symbolic because most drug dealers weren't declaring their income anyway. But when cannabis dispensaries started to come along and pay their federal taxes, a few years later, the IRS found this rule and came back to them and said, hey, thanks for paying your taxes. By the way, you're not allowed to take any deductions. And they started hitting companies with huge bills for back taxes. And that remains an issue today. Plant-touching cannabis businesses cannot take tax deductions, so payroll tax deductions and property tax deductions, all the deductions that normal businesses rely on for solvency. They can subtract cost of goods sold because of a technical loophole where that's a subtraction and not deduction, but it has a huge effect on the bottom line. To give you an idea, we did an analysis a couple of years ago where we looked at the financials of a bunch of dispensaries of different sizes and operating in different states, and built sort of an archetypal dispensary that represented a sort of happy medium. And when we ran the numbers, we found that that average dispensary was operating at less than a 1% margin because of 280E. With 280E removed, that margin jumps up to 12% overnight. So that's a huge issue, and it will be interesting to see what potentially new federal taxes do to offset that. One of the big challenges with legal cannabis businesses is they're often competing against unregulated businesses. So if governments create a tax burden that's too high, it really makes it tough to outcompete the unregulated market.
David, thank you so much for your insights today.
Yeah, thank you.
And for more of our coverage, head on over to investors.com. For Investors Business Daily, I'm Alexis Garcia.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching Investors Business Daily on YouTube. If you want to watch more videos, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a thing.